Okay, good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us to talk about Montessori here in the 21st century. Before we begin, can you just raise your hand if you have some slight knowledge about Montessori, what Montessori schools are? Okay, good. Good. So if you're familiar with Montessori, then you may know that it is a developmental constructivist approach to education. It's actually a curriculum, a philosophy, a theory of child development. It's many things. We could talk about that all day. But we're here today to talk about what this century-old pedagogy has to offer us here in the 21st century. So Montessori is the largest alternative pedagogy in the world. There are 4,000 Montessori schools here in the United States alone, serving children from birth all the way up through high school, and 580 of those schools are actually public schools. So this is pretty remarkable given that this is something that comes to us from Dr. Maria Montessori in the early 1900s. So we're here today with our esteemed panelists to talk about what Montessori has to teach us here in 2023. So this first question is going to be for Jana and then for Matt Kramer. So one of the things that has changed a lot in those 100+ years is that technology has really transformed our lives. So from a Montessori perspective, how should educators be thinking about this change and the role of technology in education?
I think this is such a great question because when we think about technology and education, it's really important that we don't put the technology before the humans that are involved in that. And so what I think is important to remember is that children's brains and their developmental needs have not changed. Children are still the same in the sense that developmentally and evolutionarily, this has been such a short period of time where technology has had such an impact that brains have not changed. And this is why you see that time and time again, the American Academy of Pediatrics, the World Health Organization, the CDC, research shows that children need to spend time with people, doing things, and that this supports Montessori's idea of that the child needs to be an active participant as a part of real life. And so there are ways that technology can be beneficial and that we can use technology, but we need to think about that more as tools. I'm going to pass it off here because I know that you have some great things to say about that.
Sure. Is this working? Great. I agree with everything she said. I think, I guess two things I'll say in addition to that. One of them is, I think that we sometimes lump all of technology together as a single thing, and there's a lot of ways to break things apart, but I might suggest we think about it as times when technology is an aid to learning something else versus when technology is the thing that we're learning. And I think Maria Montessori, who was a pretty technologically oriented person herself at the time, she would have been enthusiastic about kids learning technology, kids learning how to use digital cameras, kids learning how to code. I think she would be much less enthusiastic about kids ever having iPads in front of them as a means to learning something else. I think it's sort of the antithesis of her thought about manipulatives and the way the mind works on real things to replace them with representations of those things. So I think that's one place where I think there's a lot of place for technology in Montessori. A second is, I think there's a lot of ways technology can support a classroom that doesn't involve changing the classroom. One of the things we're working on at Wildflower is we use technology, we use computer vision and artificial intelligence to pay attention to what the kids are doing and recreate the same sorts of things that a Montessori teacher would observe if they were going through the Montessori observation protocols to actually take all of that and capture it passively so that the teacher at the end of the day can have access to all the information as if they had just followed around each kid and made note of what they were doing. When did they take out each material? How long did they use it? Were they concentrated? Did they make the choice independently? And I think there's a lot of things like that that are maybe underexplored now that are promising.
All right, this next question is for Alice, and then we'll turn it over to Jana. Another thing that we are learning about in recent years is the impact that we're having on the environment. How can Montessori help us address the challenges that we're facing now around food systems and nutrition and environmental sustainability? We'll start with you, Alice.
Well, I think you probably know that I deeply believe that we need edible education. which is, in my mind, Montessori education. We need to be touching, smelling, tasting. We need to be engaged in that way, and food does that, and gardens do that. But I'm thinking really big about the public school system, and the only way that I see to get into the schools is through the cafeteria door. It's the only door that has a possibility of being opened right now. And what if we decided, or let's say the head of the Department of Agriculture in the country decided that we should all be eating local, organic, regenerative food, and that our students should be engaged with that whole system, that they could even be going out to the nearby farms in a very Montessori biology class. But I think that food and with education is our great hope, because to solve the issue of climate, or to even think about it in a hopeful way, it has to be about food and how the food is grown. Because we know regenerative ag pulls the carbon down in the ground. But just imagine that kids would be learning about that in kindergarten, that they would be out in the garden. They'd learn what it's like to have all those little bugs and everything feeding the nutrition to the food in a healthy soil. And it's just like, I mean, all of her ideas have empowered everything that I've done. And I really mean that. I designed the restaurant so that it would subliminally connect people when they walked in with a good aroma. There would be something beautiful in the room that they would connect. Of course, I always would put something on the table that they had to peel with their hands, that I wanted all of the senses stimulated. And people don't know that I'm doing this in a calculated way. It's so calculated, the music's not too high. But you're really, when there's not a good aroma, I take rosemary and burn it and walk through the restaurant so that when people came in, they'd say, oh, what is this? I sometimes bake bread just for the aroma in the room. And I guess it's worked like a charm because we're in our 52nd year.
Woohoo,
but
love that.
I know that it works in the classroom. And I know that in theory, even people reading about it are part of a network now that is 6,200 schools around the world. And they're using a kitchen and a garden to teach academic subjects. This is not a cooking class, and it's not a gardening class.
I love that so much, and I agree with you, and I believe that Montessori would agree with you too. It is not uncommon for Montessori schools, current traditional Montessori schools, people believe, have extended work cycles in the afternoon, but I would encourage you to look for an article that is in the edition Guided by Nature of the NAMTA Journal, and the article is called The House of Children. And when you see The House of Children, she describes, first of all, what the ideal school looks like, and when you look at that and then take the schedule of the day, the entire schedule of the day after lunch was completely outside. And in this article, she talks about the importance of just what you're saying. She is saying that children need to play a part in raising the food that they eat, and that this will help them, first of all, because we know that if you eat it, if you raise it, if you prepare it, you're going to eat it, that it will expose them to this, and it creates a love of the world that will carry through the child's life. And when the child is older, they are going to fight to protect that thing. They associate it with warmth and safety and a sense of unity because you're all working together in that garden. And I absolutely 100% agree with you that when you have children beside or alongside other community members, that they are going to, first of all, build that physical community, but then also begin this tradition of recognizing that we have to care for the earth and that we love the earth and we want to provide those opportunities to our children. So, and I think that, even further academically, when we think about the opportunities in elementary children should be outside. You should not learn about plants from 3-part cards. You should learn about plants from plants. And that the way that you do that is to be outside. We know that research backs up being outside. We know that research backs up the importance of play. And we can have playful learning in those very meaningful and purposeful experiences.
Another thing that's changed in the last 100 years is that the standards movement and testing has transformed public education. What perspective does Montessori have to offer us on this idea of assessment? And this question is for Letty, and then we'll go to you, Matt Kramer.
So this is an interesting question to think about and talk about. I was actually in a session yesterday where they were talking about conventional assessments, and they have the same challenge that we do in Montessori education. We've been just thinking about it for a very long time, in that people want to move away from the standard fill-in-the-bubble kind of a question assessments, but the problem is that those are the least costly to administer, and this is kind of why that we have come to that point. And so before I kind of talk about how we do things in Montessori with assessment, I can kind of compare like both of them if I look at the 2 different classrooms. So if I was thinking about a traditional classroom and the teacher was going to be teaching addition with uncommon denominators, and so maybe they have a class of like 30 kids, it's a single graded class, maybe it's like 4th grade, and the teacher is going to teach a lesson on adding with uncommon denominators. And then maybe there's going to be some visual aids. These days, even in traditional classrooms, there are. And then the children are going to practice. They're going to have problems that they're going to do, and those problems are going to be some sort of an abstract problem. They might have had a visual aid to look at, but they're going to be doing the problem in the abstract. And then the teacher needs to figure out, oh, do they know this or do they not know this? I'm going to give them a test on it. And so then they're going to have 30 pages turned in, and she's going to have to look at it later on. So that's sort of a conventional assessing in the classroom. In a Montessori classroom, particularly I'm Montessori elementary trained, you will have, there's a work cycle, there's a teacher giving a small group lesson, and the other children are out in the environment either doing some sort of follow-up work to that lesson, or they are doing some sort of skill-based practice, practicing their handwriting, their math facts, or they're doing big work, which is like independent projects or project-based on lessons. And so the teacher's going to be sitting there giving a lesson to anywhere from like 2 to 8 kids. Usually it's around 4 or 5 kids. So let's say they have 5 kids, and she's giving a lesson on adding with uncommon denominators. She's going to pull them together, and she's going to look around for a minute, and she's going to be like, wow, I wonder if they remember equivalency, because I gave an equivalency lesson a while back. Let me sit down and see if they understand that. And, so she might give them a couple of problems. There's Montessori materials to be demonstrating it. Let's say 2 of the kids, totally deer in the headlights, don't remember this at all. She can say, okay, how about you guys go do something else, and I'm going to come and get you later on because I want to show you something different. And so they'll go away, and then she'll give the lesson to the other 3 who are ready for the lesson. So it's not like in a traditional setting, when you have 30 kids and you're giving a lesson to everybody at once, then and you give an assessment, you can't really change things in real time. But if you're giving small group lessons, you can change things in real time, and you can adjust. And that's formative assessment is a big part of Montessori education because you're doing it in the moment and it's informing your future instruction at the time. And so the teacher can look and see and observe. We use observation, we check for understanding, we have them maybe write a little summary, we see them do the materials. And so that's kind of how we assess. Now, is that something you can put on a standardized test? No, not very easily. There are lots of things that Montessori has done in recent years, or the Montessori movement. Katie works for National Center for Montessori in the Public Sector, and her organization has created and developed a bunch of tools, rubrics, checklists, and things for them to look at observation, look at the individual child, and really look at a holistic picture, because we don't want to just look at their math and language scores, because children are much more than that. What about their science and their history and their life skills and their executive functioning? And there's also the DERS, which is Developmental Environment Rating Scale. Did I get that right, Katie? Okay, I'm terrible with acronyms. So this is is a test of like executive functioning and the environment and the adults and their interactions in the environment. So here's a start of us moving towards changing assessment, so we're not just doing the paper and pencil, and moving towards something more holistic. And I guess my dream, being at this Education of Technology conference, is that eventually we will be able to have some sort of artificial intelligence that will be able to, we can lay over the current assessments or redo the assessments. I really get into this kind of stuff. That will be able to personalize the kind of assessments that Montessori educators really value and need, because again, we have kids who are learning about squaring binomials when they're 8 years old with our Montessori materials, but they don't know that abstractly yet. And a lot of times our kids, are multiplying and dividing large numbers when they're, 6 and 7 years old, but they're doing that with materials and they're not doing that on paper and pencil. So those standardized tests are not really a measure of what they know. And so I'm excited to see the sort of future of assessment now that we do have these artificial intelligence options, that it can customize and personalize that even further. Yeah. So now I'm going to give it to Matt so he can have it.
That was a good intro. We're actually working on that.
I'm just dying to say something. Because, as I said before, that our senses are our pathways into our minds. Mm-hmm. That if we aren't touching and tasting and smelling and looking carefully, we don't get the information into our minds. And I think it's one of the biggest issues right now is that people feel like almost they're in jail because their senses have not been stimulated. And I took my Montessori training in London, and I'm just going to say that to this day, because I traced all the leaves in Hampstead Heath, and I had to put them in my notebook, and I had to calligraph the name of the tree. I know to this day all the trees in Hampstead Heath. And it's a way of just feeling. And as you were saying, you need to remember. You need to feel it with all your senses. You have to, you remember things more when you're in a room where you're seeing things or outside. And that's what we're missing. We're taking grades that are based on a kind of knowledge that isn't feeding us deeply. And that's what Montessori can give us, is that. I'm sorry I interrupted, I had to say.
Thank you.
That's great. Two thoughts. One, just build off what Alice just said. I think the standards movement has appropriately posed the question about whether kids are learning the things that you need to learn to be an educated adult, a participant in society. People need to learn those things. Montessorians believe that kids need to learn those things too. I think the thing that is most troubling about the direction the standards movement has taken us is the way it has set up the questions about what it is to know how to do those things and then how we know whether kids know how to do those things sets it up as a direct trade-off with the activity of looking for, as we say in the Montessori, we're looking for your cosmic purpose, looking for your cosmic task. And if we create an education system that takes teachers who see a pivot point in a kid's life where they're on one way they can go down to try to master a standard, and the other way they can find what their life is going to be about. And we say what we want to happen in that moment is choose the first path. Go down the path of mastering an additional standard. We're making a big mistake, and teachers know that. And not just Montessori teachers, but teachers generally know that, and it's why there's such a teacher-led resistance to hardcore, narrow implementation of assessments and standards-aligned education. I think that's a big problem. I think we have to find a way to leave space in education for kids to figure out what they're supposed to be in the world and not treat that as the enemy of standards. Second, just to respond directly to the thing you said, I think I agree entirely with what you said, and I think it's interesting. There's lots of things in the world where we have figured out a way to take something that people observe and make it more structured. You know, as you said, rubrics for looking at the way that teachers create developmentally appropriate environments. You know, when we ask a professional psychologist to come in and do an evaluation of a kid, they don't just look and make up an answer. They've got like a whole bunch of checklists they're going through to figure things out. And I think if you ask Montessori teachers what they would most like to know in the classroom, they give answers that are those same sorts of things. They say things about what you can see a kid doing and how you would interpret what the kid is doing. They're pretty systematic, actually. They're not soft things. They're just not things that lend themselves very well to a bubble test. And I agree with the comment you made. I think the big hope of this moment is one of the things we're working on in Wildflower Labs is that we can basically teach computers to do some of that work for us, and so that we can have just as structured an educational assessment approach as we have today, but we can have it on the things that teachers most want to know, as opposed to the things that are cheapest to measure.
I'm going to invite Matt Bateman to jump in here, and then we'll come back to you, Alice. How do you envision the future of education, and what role do you think Montessori schools can play in shaping that future?
So I'm going to talk about the past, and then I'm going to talk about Montessori, and then maybe I'll say something about the future. Because that's what this panel is about, I guess. School, like primary education, like what we think of today as K-8, like that kind of core age where students go to school, it emerged in the West in the 6th century BC in the Mediterranean. And the look of school then was, it was very focused on literacy. Literacy was a new thing. Culture was becoming literary again with the Phoenician alphabet. So that was the first thing. It's like hard to learn how to read, and it's especially hard to learn how to read when you haven't invented punctuation and space and lowercase letters yet. So there's a lot of drills on literacy. And then the second thing is enculturation, mainly literature, like the Homeric epics, but also music, dance, physical education, a little bit of math and science, all mainly not to make you into a mathematician or a scientist. It wasn't like STEM. It was like, this is culture. This is Greek culture. This is what they wanted their students to be exposed to as they were growing up. They thought it would make their children good to expose them to these things. So it was literacy and moral education. And the pedagogy was, you would come in, and your teacher would say something to you, tell you something, explain something, give you some kind of model to work with, and then you would copy it. And it was very rote. You would copy it exactly, you would repeat it. You were kind of, it was a kind of like caricature of what we would think of as traditional education today, where the teacher would say something, and then your job as the student was to copy it. And nobody liked it. Like, we have ancient complaints of students who hated school, and this is like part of the historical record. And what did we do when students didn't like it and didn't do it? Well, we punished them. And that was the kind of pedagogy. That was primary education in classical antiquity. It was primary education in Hellenistic times, in Rome, in Persia. That was primary education in Byzantium. That was primary education in medieval Europe once they got less kind of wealthy enough to remember literacy. That was primary education in England. That was primary education in America. The education that Lincoln got in Kentucky in the 1800s was basically the same as the education that you would get in Hellenistic Egypt. The model did not change. The model did not change even as the world changed. So in the 16th, 17th, 18th centuries, like we got the scientific revolution and the industrial revolution, the political revolutions, like human liberation was a thing. This is all still ongoing. Like we're in the grips of modernity. It took a long time for education to change, a really long time. It's not really until the 20th century that people start rethinking education. And then at the beginning of the 20th century, finally, there's this flowering of creative thinking about education. With the progressive education movements, some of it's very exciting, some of it's kind of dark and creepy and Tayloristic and eugenics, and it all gets mixed together with the fact that we want more students to be in school and school is becoming public and universalized. It's a crazy interesting time for education. And at this time, there is one thinker who really created something that was philosophically radical and had like an implementation plan, like a curriculum, a teacher training, different practices that was like a different model of education that is kind of fundamentally different enough and enduring enough and specific enough to endure. And that, I mean, this is Montessori. I mean, there's a reason why there are 4,000 Montessori schools in the US and tens of thousands across the world, and why we still talk about her 120 years later. She solved problems in education. I mean, both the philosophical problems, like, the thing that Montessori is most famous for is human liberation. Like, you give children freedom, very young children freedom, in a way that was unprecedented at the time. The thing that she's second most famous for is teaching 3-year-olds how to write. I mean, that's what put her on the map internationally at a time when progressive educators were like, whoa, like, let's stop brainwashing children into writing with classical drills. This is crazy. Like, let's put it off until like they're 12 or 8 or something. Montessori was like, no, I can make children fall in love with it at 3 by breaking the task down, by engineering it, by breaking the task down into like 27 steps and making it a game that you start when you're at the age of 2, and they all love it, and they're all motivated to do it, and they will choose to do it, and they will fall in love with it, and it will be connected with their agency. There's this whole process that she went through, and she documented it, and she trained people on it, and she designed curriculum on it, and it was connected with this philosophy of human liberation and agency. So, I mean, the way that I think about the future of education is Montessori is education is very primitive. Still today, it's very, very primitive. It's like medicine, ancient medicine, when all you had was Galen in the 1st century AD. You could probably get some things fixed, and he could set some bones and give you some remedies, but like, you wouldn't want to go to the doctor in the 1st century AD. Like, they were as likely to hurt you as they were to help you. Like, that's the state of education today. It's very early stage. Like, we're 100 years into really figuring out what education is. And Montessori is Galen. Like, Montessori is the person who was like, look, here are the principles, here's the kind of scientific approach, here's the philosophy of that, here are the actual practices that you need to at least get started. It's very foundational, it's very fundamental, and it's very scalable. There are Montessori schools in every culture across the world. It's not just a niche thing for Italian children. And it's extensible. And so, at Higher Ground, I work at a company, a Montessori startup. We started about 7 years ago. I think we're the biggest Montessori network in the world, depending on how you measure it, I guess, certainly in the US. And we picked Montessori because it's unlike all the other progressive pedagogies, some of which are amazing and like have interesting things to say. I don't think that they're awful. They're not systems. They don't have the kind of, education it's a specific task. It's a problem to solve. It's not enough to say, give children freedom. It's easy to give children freedom, but they don't learn very much. And it's easy to coerce children into learning, but they hate it. It's hard to do both, and that's what Montessori solved. So that's our starting point, and then the question is, what does that look like in the future? And I think that pattern is the future. The pattern is a philosophy of human liberation and agency, and like really dedicated specialists who take that idea with love and figure out how to make everything learnable in the same way that Montessori made writing learnable, by doing task analyses and creating specialized tools and making children fall in love with it. And doing that birth to adulthood is, it's going to look, in 500 years, it's going to be like crazy what education looks like. It's going to be unrecognizable in the same way that modern medicine is unrecognizable. If you look back 500 years, it's just totally different. But we will look back and we will see the pattern and the foundation in Montessori. I think Montessori is the beginning of the future of education. And that's certainly how we think about it. So, yeah.
And I want to say here that we also just need to pay teachers. That's just what we need to do. We need to pay teachers.
Well, I think the most important thing is that we teach our kids that going to school is fun, that it's really desirable to be in a beautiful room. And that's, I mean, I just know that there's a lot of Montessori equipment that is expensive, and, you know, and it's had a bad reputation because of that. But we've created an edible schoolyard that is a Montessori place, but it's using all of the ideas, but we made them in the school. And we got, for instance, when we were building a fence, we got a woodworker to come and who was really good and showed the kids how to build the fence. And they helped us sand the wood and how to got it. And it's that experience of beauty and of empowerment. I can't say enough about empowerment, because these kids, when they cook it, they feel really accomplished. And I know that even in kindergarten, Montessori was always having kids to pour a pitcher of water into a glass without spilling. And some people think that that's you know, a kind of instruction that's unnecessary. But that's something beautiful and empowering, to be able to do that. And when you can do that for other people, to pour the tea carefully into a teacup. I mean, we have really lost our way about the very simple pleasures of learning that you know, just last for your whole life. They really do. And I see that you know, food, of course, is that place where we can teach all kinds of things simultaneously and address climate and health. But we can teach all of those practices of setting a table. I mean, to learn them when you're in second grade is wonderfully empowering. But to have that for your whole life, to know the really pleasure of it, is something we've lost and we need to find.
I want to say that I think what you're describing is this balance of independence and interdependence.
Yeah.
And if you focus on either one of those to the extreme, you don't get the benefits that you do. So pouring water is not just about being able to serve yourself water. It allows you the opportunity to be in service to your community.
Yeah.
And that when everybody is building themselves up for the purpose of being able to build their community. And it is through community that Montessori describes us as all having to live together. That is how we unify. We are all a group of humans who share a planet, and it is in our best interest to care about other people as well as ourselves. And children have to see that. The only way that they are going to internalize that is to have experiences where adults are proving that it's true. And that is what we have a chance to do as educators, is to kind of reprioritize and think about how can this child have an experience of agency, but where they also can see what their cosmic task is, how they can serve other people in the meantime. And I think that's kind of the path that we need to follow, instead of just thinking about children who are going to be successful individuals. We have to think about children who can, yes, take care of themselves, but what is the thing that they can do that will make the world better? Because everybody has that. And helping children discover what that is not going to reside exclusively in a math score or a language score. There are, we are multifaceted humans, and thank goodness there are people whose beauty and skill and art and talent lies in art or music or gardening. And if we don't show that we value those things, children will believe us that we don't value it. So I see us as kind of like, we can be a scaffold. This can be a reality. You have shown that it works. Montessori believed that it worked too, and I would encourage us all to take small steps to do that thing.
We have a few minutes. Are there any questions that you all have in the audience that you'd like to pose to our panel?
No questions?
Or any questions that our panelists would like to pose to each other?
Are there Montessori schools that are feeding kids lunch? Have they focused on organic food?
I can speak to the school where I spent the most time. It was a public school, and it went from 6 weeks old through high school. My husband is a secondary teacher there, and for a number of years, they worked with, actually Whole Foods helped them. They built an organic garden on the property, and all of the learners would be the people who were growing it. Then they would have salad bars. They would sell the extra produce in car line, so children would stand out with their little fresh produce bags, and parents, when they picked up their child, would do that. And they saw a lot of things. So they saw how business works, how economics work. They saw how community works. And so I can't speak for how many are doing that around, but I do know that in my area there are 3 public Montessori schools that are incorporating gardening into the work that they do with children in meaningful ways where it's going to be useful.
And just really quickly, when I was in Europe, I went and visited a few Montessori schools, and they are very good at just making the meal an exquisite part of the day in a way that I haven't quite seen in other places, and I think that we can replicate here in the United States.
You had a question? Oh.
I have a question for Matt Bateman. So can you elaborate on, you said that Montessori made writing learnable, and that will generalize that to make anything learnable. Can you kind of explain like how you might imagine that process unfolding?
So I'll say a little bit. Yeah, okay. So part of what Montessori did is she said, what's hard about learning literacy? And like taking that that question kind of in a way that's psychologically serious, in a way that I think was unprecedented at her time. And she analyzed the task into, okay, there's the kind of reading, there's the decoding, and to get that you need the letters in the alphabet. There's also the writing part of it, which involves like you have to have a lot of fine motor control. You need your muscles to work in a certain way. There's being able to pick out and identify sounds in speech and mapping those onto graphemes. So there's all these different things that go into writing. And one by one, she essentially turned all of these things into beautiful, this gets at some of the things that Alice was saying, like really beautiful, enjoyable kind of presentations, games, activities that are presented to children with a kind of love and care and kind of like almost like secrecy and seduction, like let me let you in on a secret, like we're gonna play a game. Where there's a whole scope and sequence starting at the age of 2 with sound games. Some of it is very indirect. Some of it is like the materials in the Montessori classroom have little pegs on them. And the reason why they have little pegs, even if it's just a puzzle and there's like 1,000 ways to do it, is because if you hold the peg in a certain way, it actually helps you train up your hand to hold a pencil. There's a way that you wash tables, a kind of very graceful way that you wash tables. What does this do? It helps steady your arm and wrist and writing muscles, so there's a motor control side of it. And then by the time you actually get to the alphabet, the alphabet is beautifully presented as these beautiful letters that you get to feel and trace that are very sensorially enticing for the child. The children are just like ready for it. They've like played sound games. They like know to kind of identify it with the sound. They're really excited about it. So it goes on and on like this, and it's like each part is kind of isolated. So you don't have to like learn how to write or read or something all at once, and it's not really complicated compared to the old model of pedagogy where you have to copy something over and over that you don't even understand and you hate it and you learn to resent it and then you get punished when you don't do it and then you move on to the more complex thing. It's just a totally different process. So I think that like the question for educators is like, if you're like a high school educator who, let's say that you're a high school, I don't know, you're passionate about teaching children in high school about chemistry. What does that look like? Like how do you teach like the periodic table and the atomic theory and all the things, and I actually think it starts with cooking, like chemistry starts with cooking. So there's a whole analysis that you could give of like what is the path to really independently understanding this such that students will choose it, but it's still systematic and it reliably imparts the knowledge, and and imparts the knowledge in a way that imparts love and understanding. Like, what does it look like to do that for everything? What are the materials that, like, what is the process by which educators even figure that out and test that over time? How does it integrate together into a process of education? So that, I mean, I think that's the future of education, and that's the thing that Montessori was the first person to really figure that out, to kind of figure out what that looks like. Sorry, that was a long answer. But.
Thank you so much for this great conversation, and thank you all for joining us.